Jack had always loved the quiet charm of his neighborhood. Tucked away in a peaceful cul-de-sac, it was the kind of place where kids played hopscotch on the sidewalks, families hosted weekend barbecues, and wind chimes sang in the afternoon breeze. It was a slice of suburban paradise, and for Jack, it was more than just a home, it was a legacy. His small, private farm sat at the very edge of the neighborhood, a proud remnant of his family's history. Surrounded by a sturdy wooden fence, the land boasted a lush vegetable garden, a cozy red barn, and a weathered rooster weather vane spinning lazily atop the roof. It was a place of peace, of hard work and tradition, and most of all, a refuge from the bureaucratic nonsense of city life. But paradise, as Jack was about to learn, always had a serpent. And in this case, its name was Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, armed with an iron will, a clipboard, and an uncanny ability to sniff out the smallest perceived infractions. To her, the neighborhood wasn't a community, it was her personal kingdom, and she ruled it with an iron fist. Most of the residents had learned to endure her reign of petty terror in silence, exchanging knowing glances behind closed doors and keeping their heads down to avoid her scrutiny. Jack, however, had never been one to bow to nonsense, and unfortunately for him, Karen had decided that his farm was an eyesore. And when Karen set her sights on something, she didn't just complain, she waged war. It began on a bright, crisp morning. Jack had just finished tending to his garden when he spotted her marching up the driveway, clipboard clutched to her chest like a badge of honor. Her expression was tight, lips pursed in that signature way that made her look like she was constantly tasting something bitter. Jack barely had time to wipe the dirt from his hands before she stopped in front of him, clearing her throat in a way that suggested she was about to deliver a verdict rather than start a conversation. "Jack, I'm sure you're aware of our HOA guidelines," she said, her tone drenched in false politeness. "I couldn't help but notice your fence is questionable." Jack raised an eyebrow. He turned to look at the fence, the same wooden fence that had stood there long before the HOA even existed, solid and well-maintained. He almost laughed. "Questionable?" he repeated, arms crossed. "It's a fence, Karen. It's literally meant to blend in." Karen narrowed her eyes, her grip tightening on the clipboard. "It doesn't align with the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood," she declared, as though she had just delivered a ruling from the Supreme Court. Then, before Jack could respond, she pulled a neatly typed violation notice from her folder and handed it to him. Jack exhaled slowly, glancing down at the paper. This was ridiculous. Of all the things to obsess over, Karen had chosen a fence. But as she turned on her heel and marched away, Jack had an unsettling feeling that this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't here to have a conversation. She was here to win a battle that Jack hadn't even realized he was fighting yet. Jack had always considered himself a patient man, but Karen was about to put that patience to the ultimate test. The morning after their first encounter, he found a bright pink violation notice taped to his front gate, stamped with the HOA's official letterhead. "Fence noncompliance, immediate action required." Jack sighed, crumpling the notice in his hand before tossing it into the trash. He had expected Karen to follow up, but not this fast. Maybe, just maybe, if he ignored it, she'd find someone else to harass. But Karen wasn't the kind of person to let things go. Over the next week, the pink slips kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. His sunflowers, apparently, were too tall and created a visual obstruction. His rooster weather vane, of all things, was deemed a reflective hazard, supposedly blinding drivers as they passed by. Even the birdhouse hanging from his oak tree was flagged as an unauthorized decorative element. Jack found himself in a surreal battle against an enemy armed with an endless supply of paperwork and an unhealthy need for control. He could almost admire the dedication if it wasn't so utterly ridiculous. One afternoon, as he stepped outside with his coffee, he spotted Karen on the sidewalk, clipboard in one hand, laser pointer in the other, measuring his fence like a crime scene investigator. Jack leaned against his porch railing, shaking his head in disbelief. "Karen, are you serious right now?" She didn't even flinch. "I'm ensuring compliance," she snapped, marking something down on her clipboard. Jack had seen a lot of nonsense in his life, but this was new. And Karen wasn't just focused on him. Word spread quickly that other neighbors were also receiving her sudden wave of HOA citations. Mike, who lived next door, got a notice because his trash cans were left out too long after pickup. Linda, the retired teacher down the street, was cited because her bird feeder allegedly attracted undesirable wildlife. Even Emily, a young mother, got an earful about how her kid's sidewalk chalk drawings weren't up to community standards. At first, the neighborhood grumbled in private, exchanging knowing glances and shaking their heads. But as Karen's power trip escalated, frustration began to boil over. And then came the final straw. Early one morning, Jack woke up to find two uniformed officers standing at his front gate. "Animal control. Sir, we received a complaint about unsanitary conditions and excessive noise coming from this property." Jack's stomach tightened. "What?" He stared at the officer, confused. His farm had always been well maintained. If anything, it was one of the cleanest properties in the entire neighborhood. The officer flipped through his notes. "The complaint states that your animals are a nuisance to the community." Jack didn't need to ask who had reported him. He could already picture Karen, standing at her kitchen window, smugly watching this unfold. Without another word, Jack led the officers around the farm, letting them inspect everything from the barn to the chicken coop. After a thorough walk-through, one officer sighed, shaking his head. "Everything looks fine here. Honestly, I don't know why we were even called." Jack forced a smile. "I have a good idea." By the time the officers left, the entire cul-de-sac had caught wind of the situation. Neighbors gathered in their yards, whispering amongst themselves. It was one thing to enforce minor HOA violations, it was another thing entirely to weaponize local authorities against a neighbor. Even those who had previously sided with Karen started reconsidering their stance. No one wanted to be the next target of her petty vendetta. Karen, of course, played innocent. "I had nothing to do with it," she insisted when confronted. "I only care about keeping our neighborhood in top shape." Jack wasn't buying it. Neither were the neighbors. And for the first time, people weren't just grumbling about Karen behind closed doors, they were openly questioning her authority. But if Karen thought she could bully Jack into submission, she was about to be sorely mistaken. Because now, Jack wasn't just going to ignore her. He was going to fight back. Jack had never been one to pick fights, but Karen had made it clear, this wasn't just about a fence, or a farm, or even a set of ridiculous HOA rules. It was about power. She wanted control, and Jack had become her personal crusade. But what Karen hadn't accounted for was that Jack wasn't the kind of man to roll over and take it. If she wanted a battle, she was going to get one. His first move was subtle but deliberate. Since Karen had cited him for having an unauthorized decorative element, his single, wooden birdhouse, Jack went out and bought 3 more, each painted in bright, cheerful colors. He mounted them proudly in his yard, positioned in plain view of Karen's house. The next day, when she walked past with her clipboard, she nearly tripped over herself doing a double take. Jack gave her a friendly wave from his porch. Then came the sunflower rebellion. If Karen wanted to claim his sunflowers were too tall, he'd make sure the whole neighborhood got involved. That weekend, Jack sent out invitations to a neighborhood sunflower contest, an open challenge for anyone willing to grow the tallest sunflower in their yard. The response was overwhelming. Families with kids jumped at the chance, elderly residents dusted off their gardening tools, and even some of Karen's former allies joined in just to irritate her. Within weeks, sunflowers were sprouting up in nearly every yard in the cul-de-sac. By the time the contest reached its peak, Karen's once pristine, HOA-approved neighborhood had transformed into a sunflower jungle. And there wasn't a single rule in the HOA bylaws prohibiting it. But Jack wasn't just having fun, he was collecting evidence. Every time Karen showed up on his property to inspect his fence, measure his grass, or take pictures of his rooster weather vane, Jack discreetly recorded her. Over the course of 2 months, he gathered hours of footage showing Karen's increasingly bizarre behavior, standing on ladders to peek over fences, pointing a laser at his barn like she was conducting a government experiment, and even knocking on neighbors' doors at night to warn them about Jack's disruptive presence. It was getting out of hand, and the more Karen pushed, the more people turned against her. The breaking point came when Mike, Jack's next-door neighbor, made a startling discovery. After receiving his own absurd violation notice for having his trash cans too close to the curb, he decided to look deeper into the HOA's financial records. What he found was shocking. Karen had been misusing HOA funds. Under the vague category of community enhancements, she had been expensing everything from flyers condemning Jack's farm to custom-printed violation slips. But the worst part? The fines she had been issuing weren't even real. The HOA had never approved them, Karen had been fabricating them, pocketing the money, and using it to fuel her crusade against Jack. Mike wasted no time. He brought the documents to Jack, who immediately saw the opportunity. This wasn't just an annoying neighborhood dispute anymore. This was fraud. And it was about to become very public. That night, Jack called a meeting with several neighbors, showing them everything, the fake fines, the wasted HOA funds, and even his recordings of Karen's antics. The reaction was immediate. People who had previously stayed neutral were furious. Even those who had sided with Karen in the past were shocked at how far she had gone. The plan was set. The next HOA meeting was coming up in a few days, and Jack was going to make sure Karen wouldn't see it coming. Because this time, he wasn't just going to fight back. He was going to end her reign for good. The HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread like wildfire that something big was about to go down, and nearly every resident in the cul-de-sac had shown up. People who usually avoided HOA meetings like the plague were now eager to witness the showdown. At the front of the room, Karen sat with her ever-present clipboard, her expression tight and composed, but Jack could see the tension in her clenched jaw. She wasn't used to this kind of turnout. She was used to controlling these meetings with minimal resistance, handing down citations like royal decrees while the few who attended nodded along in forced compliance. But tonight, the air was different. People were whispering, exchanging looks, and for the first time in a long time, Karen wasn't the one holding the power. Karen cleared her throat, standing up with an air of authority. Before we begin, I'd like to address the pressing issue regarding community standards and the increasing disregard for HOA regulations, she announced, her voice carrying the self-righteous weight of someone who truly believed they were saving the neighborhood from destruction. She clicked a remote, and behind her, a projector screen flickered to life. A slideshow titled "The Farm Problem" appeared in bold letters. Jack almost laughed. She had actually put together a presentation about him. Karen continued, flipping through slides filled with dramatic, zoomed-in photos of his fence, his rooster weather vane, and, most absurdly, a sunflower standing slightly taller than the others. As you can see, these infractions disrupt the harmony of our neighborhood, she pressed on, her voice filled with exaggerated concern. And if we don't take action now, we risk. Jack stood up. Karen, let's talk about real infractions. The room fell silent. Karen faltered for just a second, but then her face hardened. Excuse me, Jack, but you do not have the floor. Actually, Jack said, holding up a folder, I do. Because while you were busy measuring my grass with a ruler, Mike over here was digging into the HOA financial records. And what we found? He dropped the folder onto the table. It's fraud, Karen. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Karen's face twitched, but she forced a smile. This is a ridiculous accusation, she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Jack flipped open the folder and pulled out copies of the fake violation fines Karen had issued, fines that weren't recorded anywhere in the official HOA budget. You've been stealing from the HOA fund, Karen. Using community money for your own vendetta. Printing your own citations. And let's not forget, calling animal control on my farm with a false complaint. Karen's face turned red. I have done no such thing, she snapped. I only act in the best interest of this community. Jack pulled out his phone. Then maybe you'd like to explain this? He tapped the screen, and suddenly, a video started playing, clear, undeniable footage of Karen trespassing on his property late at night, spray painting his fence. The same fence she had later cited him for, community defacement. The room exploded. People gasped, neighbors turned to each other in disbelief, and even the most passive members of the HOA board looked horrified. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, but no words came out. That, Jack said, letting the video continue playing, is a crime. And I'm guessing I'm not the only one in this neighborhood you've done this to. One by one, neighbors began standing up, recounting their own experiences with Karen's petty abuse of power. Mike told the story of how she fined him for leaving his trash cans out 5 minutes too long. Linda talked about how Karen tried to claim her bird feeder was inviting dangerous wildlife. Emily stood up and revealed how Karen actually called the cops on her kids for drawing chalk on the sidewalk. The pressure mounted, and the HOA board, which had remained quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke. One of the senior members, a woman who had clearly had enough, stood up and adjusted her glasses. Based on the evidence presented tonight, she announced, Karen has not only overstepped her authority, but has also violated multiple HOA bylaws, including trespassing, harassment, and misuse of community funds. Karen's face was now a deep shade of red. You can't do this. I am the HOA president. Not anymore, the woman replied, shaking her head. Effective immediately, you are removed from your position. The room erupted into applause. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her grip tightening on her clipboard as if it were a lifeline. Then, realizing she had lost, she grabbed her folder, spun on her heel, and stormed out of the meeting. And just like that, Karen's reign of HOA terror was over. The neighborhood felt different the next morning. Lighter. Freer. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the cul-de-sac, and for the first time in years, people weren't looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next ridiculous citation to appear in their mailboxes. Karen was gone. Stripped of her power, she had retreated into her house, blinds drawn tight, refusing to acknowledge the world outside. But karma, as they say, works in funny ways. A week after her dramatic downfall, a fresh violation notice landed on Karen's doorstep, only this time, she was the recipient. With Mike stepping in as interim HOA president, a full review of community standards was conducted, and to no one's surprise, Karen's own property was a shining example of non-compliance. The plastic pink flamingos littering her front yard? Not HOA approved. The overly bright, flashing holiday lights she had strung up weeks before the official decorating period? A clear violation. And the real kicker? Her own fence was 2 inches taller than regulations allowed. Karen was livid. She stormed over to Mike's house, clutching the violation notice in a white-knuckled grip, her face twisted in outrage. This is a joke, she spat, waving the paper in front of him. You know these rules don't apply to me. Mike, ever calm, simply smirked. Rules are rules, Karen. The neighborhood relished the poetic justice. As Karen fumed, neighbors gathered on Jack's farm for a celebration that doubled as a farewell party. The community had come together in ways they never had before, united by their shared experiences of Karen's tyranny and their collective relief at her downfall. Linda unveiled a sunflower-shaped plaque in Jack's honor, reading, "Jack, defender of the neighborhood." Laughter and cheers filled the air, and for the first time in years, the cul-de-sac felt like home again. And then, one quiet afternoon, a moving truck appeared in front of Karen's house. No announcement, no goodbyes, just a hurried packing job and a scowling face peeking out from behind the blinds one last time. By the evening, she was gone. No one knew exactly where she went, and no one really cared. What mattered was that her reign was over, and life could finally return to the way it was meant to be, peaceful, neighborly, and free from clipboard tyranny. But HOA horror stories are far from rare, and Karen wasn't the first person to abuse her power. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.